Hello, and thank you for watching another video. This is the second video in the April Online Professional Development session, and today's lesson connects directly to yesterday's lesson. Yesterday we talked about how important it is to identify genre and to teach our students to identify genre, and not only to identify, but then to use genre in a way to help us make meaning, to understand that when we're reading fiction, we're using story elements, and then the different types of fiction, whether it be historical fiction, reading for the history, or science fiction, watching the time travel or the other scientific elements. And then we have literary nonfiction, where sometimes, many times, it feels like a story, but it's all true. And so we're reading for information. So the lesson that I will be sharing today is called the Roadmap Lesson. And it really has been beneficial to my own students in this idea that we need to make sure that we are actively engaged in our reading, that we're thinking about our reading, and that we have a goal in mind, that we don't just pick up a book and start reading, that first we identify the genre and we get prepared to utilize the elements of the genre to make meaning. And next, that we map out what it is that we're going to read. So here's the lesson for today. So a friend of mine invited me over to her home, and she asked me to be there at 6 p.m. for dinner. And I said, yes, that would be great. And then I got in my car and I just started driving. And I realized that I had no address. So how was I going to ever find my friend's house? I knew the area she lived in, and I could continue to just keep driving. However, wouldn't it make more sense, and wouldn't it be much better use of my mileage, my gas mileage, if I knew point A to point B, the ending point, and I knew where I should turn left and where I should turn right, and the speed limit along the way, and all of the other factors along the way to get to my friend's house. So reading is just like this, in the sense that we want to have the end point in mind. We know that we pick up a text, and if it's a chapter book, that we want to get to the end of it. And it is a good idea to have a roadmap of the book that we're reading, and to make sure that we're using the components of that book, of that genre, to help us to make meaning, to help us to stay on track, to help us know there are certain points of it that maybe we know that we're going to be reading a little faster because it might be exciting and something's about to happen. Or there's points where the author is deciding to use lots of figurative language to set the stage and to really have us visualize a setting and a place. So we want to, as readers, make sure that we set goals each time we sit down to read, and we pay attention to what we're reading, and we know that end point on the road where we're going is the analogy, and that we use our mileage. We know that reading mileage is, the more we read, the better readers that we will become, and we want to use that mileage well. We want to make sure that we're building our reading muscles in our brains. So, for example, I'm going to use Charlotte's Web again today. It's a great book, and truly all the different lessons can come from this book. That's just a side note. So here we are. So I am looking at Charlotte's Web, and I am identifying it that it is fiction, and it's realistic fiction. And then I'm going to look at how many chapters. Oh, it has a lot of chapters. So, and the chapters are about 10 pages each. So I am thinking to myself that that this is realistic fiction, and I'm going to probably in the beginning of the book get to know the characters and the setting, and then it looks like just from the chapter titles that a lot of events are going to build the plot in this story. So Chapter 1. Before breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night. I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, One of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a picture of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up to her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair!" cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl's one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I have ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house and I will bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton. There inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," Mr. Arable said, "saved from an untimely death. And may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off that tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "look at him. He's absolutely perfect." So readers, what I'm doing as I'm reading through this is I am following my route of fiction. So that is my map for reading. And I'm staying actively engaged because I'm thinking about the characters, because I know stories start with the characters. And when I know to think about the characters and think closely, I'm thinking about how Papa responds to Fern and how Mama responds to Fern, and getting to know Fern, that she's a young child and her character traits are starting to come out, that she's quite bold, that she sees an injustice and she boldly addresses it with her father, and compassionate because she cares about this pig who she just, the only thing she knows is it's a baby and she wants to save its life. And her father, at first, from the beginning, we might think, oh, it's terrible what he's going to do. But then we start to think about it and we start to think about the setting. And he's a farmer and this is what farmers do. However, he must have a soft side for his daughter because she has changed his mind and he has now given her this runt pig. So now, you see, I'm thinking about the characters, the roadmap, and now I'm thinking about the setting. And I am inferring that it's on a farm just because of the things that have been said, that there's pigs and there's this idea that they know what to do with the pigs. I'm also thinking that the mother takes care of everyone because she has the place set and the breakfast out. And that's her job, to take care of her family. So I'm curious more to confirm, are they actually on a farm, which I think they are. And now I'm curious to see where the plot goes. So my roadmap, character settings, and now the plot is beginning. And I'm thinking closely about what has just happened, and now I'm already making predictions as a reader of how to get to that next point in the story. And from what is said, I think that Fern is going to take very good care of the pig because she seems very bold and very compassionate. And I think she'll be bold and compassionate in taking care of this pig the way that a pig needs to be taken care of. So then I would continue to read. And that is how I roadmap with fiction. Now I also want to show you how I would use a roadmap and teach my students with biography. And again, it's connected to yesterday's lesson in this idea that I need to understand that nonfiction, also called literary nonfiction or narrative nonfiction, is different than fiction because everything I read in here is real. Everything is a fact. And so my roadmap will depend on what type of nonfiction. Is it a nonfiction that has lots of graphs and charts and pictures and so forth, and lists, bold print, and lists words and building my vocabulary? Or is it a nonfiction like this that goes across chapter by chapter and it tells his entire life? So this is how I would do using a roadmap and modeling for my students how to make a roadmap for their reading and a plan and stick closely to their reading for a biography, a literary nonfiction. So today I want to continue and read Who Was Neil Armstrong? And yesterday I identified that this is literary nonfiction, so everything in here is real. And so now I really want to make a plan of how I'm going to read this, my map for reading. And when I look at the table of contents, there are many chapters, and the chapters are titled, and it looks like it is the story of his life across from childhood to adulthood. So as I get my mind ready for this, I'm prepared to read, to learn information, and I know that I've heard of Neil Armstrong before, and I know if there's a book about him, that he's very famous, and I do know he's an astronaut. So my mind, the roadmap is to think across his life, and it looks like it's in order of his life. So I want to keep saying to myself, maybe chronologically, in order, sequentially, it tells his childhood, the things that he did, it tells his young adult life, and it tells his career and how he got to be an astronaut. So my mind will stay close to the text because I'm thinking about what am I going to learn about Neil Armstrong. And not only will I learn facts about him, but maybe he will inspire me. Maybe he will inspire me to have courage and to do different things. So this chapter is called A Boy Who Loved Flying. Just after midnight on April 5th, 1930, Neil Armstrong was born in the Ohio farmhouse that belonged to his grandparents. Neil was the oldest of Stephen and Viola Armstrong's 3 children. He had a younger sister named June and a younger brother named Dean. Neil was always his mother's pet. She once wrote that he was a pleasure for us to raise in every way. Maybe that was because Neil was a lot like his mother, calm, serious, and determined. Neil never had trouble making friends, still he was shy and not as fun-loving as Dean. Neil's mother stayed at home caring for the children. She also taught Sunday school. Neil's father worked for the Ohio state government. Because of his job, the family had to move many times. In fact, they moved 16 times before Neil was 13. Finally, the Armstrongs settled in a little town in Ohio. And it even shows a map. So I'm reading this and I'm learning information. I've already learned that Neil Armstrong was a calm and kind, determined child, and that his mother really respected him and really enjoyed him. And I'm wondering, thinking about the roadmap, thinking about this is a biography and that he was successful, I'm wondering if already I've learned some of his character traits as a real person, being calm and serious and determined, if these are the character traits that he continued to build throughout his life that helped him to be a courageous astronaut. In the 1930s, planes were still thought of as unusual and exciting. Many people had never flown in one. Only 3 years before Neil was born in 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. He was the first person to make a transatlantic flight, and it took 33 and a half hours. To get to Europe, people from the United States traveled by ship, which took 4 days on a luxury liner. For long trips across the country, people took trains. In 1930, it took about a week to get from New York to California by the railroad. From the time he was a little boy, Neil was fascinated by airplanes and flying. When he was just a toddler, he saw an air show in Cleveland, Ohio with his dad. Neil took his first plane ride when he was only 6 years old. The plane was called the Tin Goose. It wasn't really made out of tin. Its strong body was made of aluminum. The Tin Goose could carry up to 12 passengers who sat on scratchy wicker seats. Its engines rattled and roared as the Goose reached a little over 100 miles an hour. Later on, Neil's father confessed that he had been scared to death when they were flying. As for Neil, he enjoyed every single minute. So I'm going to stop here and think about my roadmap of biography. And I have learned so much information already about this book that I know is about Neil Armstrong. I've learned about the era that he was born in, and that it was at a time when he was born that airplanes, not everybody flew airplanes on a regular basis. And there were people that had come ahead of him, though, and had done the Lindbergh. It makes me curious to research a little bit more about Charles Lindbergh and know about his transatlantic flight. But it also shows me, too, as I continue to read and think about that when I'm reading literary nonfiction, I'm learning facts, I'm learning things about people that make me wonder and expand my knowledge. And here it says, so he, at a very young age, flew in an airplane. And again, going back to what I'd already read on my roadmap, he was calm. And now we're learning as a child that he flew in an airplane, and it really sparked an interest. So I'm very engaged with this text. I'm sticking to the map of biography, of knowing that it's going to tell about the years across his life leading up to how he became an astronaut. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that it is helpful in this idea of helping our students to think about and have a roadmap, have a destination for when they're reading, and know that the directions along the way are the elements of the genre. And again, connected to yesterday's lesson of when we're reading fiction, use those elements to know when to stop and think about the history moments, if it's historical fiction, the real history in there, or to stop and think if it's a mystery and make predictions as to who do you think committed the crime. And when it's biography, to have our brains thinking the roadmap is as we go along, we're learning about whatever the topic is that the book is about. Okay, great. Thank you so much, and take care.